Well, I'd like to welcome you all here. Some of you know I'm welcoming you to First Unitarian Universalist Church of Nashville. We are so glad you could join us here tonight for our annual Human Rights Lecture, the Palmer Lecture. And I am the senior minister, lead minister here, Gail Seavey, and really looking forward to hearing the minister who preceded me, Mary Katherine Morn, and we're going to have Iba Surface is going to introduce Mary Katherine. Thank you, Iba.
Well, good evening. I'm so glad to see all of you here. I'll just add my welcome to Mary Katherine's. I'm Iba Surface. Like she said, I've been a member of this congregation for 25 years. And just a little side note, I joined this congregation on the very first day that Mary Katherine preached when she was our interim minister. So it's sort of a full circle for me to get to introduce her now. The Reverend Mary Katherine Morn is President and Chief Executive Officer of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. It was founded in 1939, and the UUSC is a nonprofit organization working internationally to advance human rights. They build teams with local partners to transform lives here in the United States and around the world. Mary Katherine joined the UUSC, sorry, I can't see over this. Mary Katherine joined the UUSC in 2018. She came from the Unitarian Universalist Association, where she was Director of Stewardship and Development, as well as Special Advisor to the President. Prior to that, she led congregations from small to large in several states. At each congregation, she helped them grow their membership, their stewardship, and their commitment to the church. In 1994, she arrived here in Nashville to be our first interim minister after David Maynard departed. As many of you know, this was a very difficult time at our church. Mary Katherine brought a vision of trust and healing to us in her 4 months as an interim, and 3 years later, in 1997, we called her as our fourth settled minister. During her years with us, the congregation continued the process of healing. Her leadership, empathy, and clear communication guided us in establishing the strong lay leadership that continues to move this congregation forward today. Now she brings these same qualities of strength, empathy, and vision to the UUSC to move the cause of human rights forward every day internationally. We're very, very proud of her, and I'm very pleased to have her with us tonight. Please welcome the Reverend Mary Katherine Morn.
From The Guardian in September 2018. Separated from his father at the U.S.-Mexico border last year, the little boy, about 7 or 8, was under the delusion that his dad had been killed, and he thought he was next. Other children believed their parents had abandoned them, and some suffered physical symptoms because of their mental trauma. Clinicians reported to investigators who were checking into the conditions of the children. You get a lot of "my chest hurts," even though everything is medically fine. And one small girl met the watchdogs and reported to them. She said, "I can't feel my heart." I don't like telling these stories, but we must. We can't ignore the real impacts of injustice and human rights abuses among people whose lives are already at risk because of the larger systems that discount, ignore, imprison, exile, displace, torture, kill, and erase them. The stories from UUSC partners wake me every day to these realities and these heartbreaks, and I'm really happy to tell you that every day in my work, I am also awakened to the courage and the vision of our partners, those who are most impacted by injustice and human rights abuses, who themselves are building a new way. I am so grateful to be here tonight. Thank you, Gail, very much. It's wonderful to be with you, my colleague. I want to thank the committee, the Robert Palmer Lecture Committee, and Iba for the introduction. I appreciate it. And for all of you, thank you so much for coming tonight. I don't remember every Robert Palmer lecture that happened while I was here, but I remember a few, a couple of days at Fisk. Some of you were there, I know. Really important moments for me to learn. And so it's incredible that I'm here. How did this happen? And thank you so much. It is an honor. I'm humbled, and I am filled with joy to be with all of you. When I was in college, I was a political science major, and I was headed to law school. Some of you may know this about me. I tripped and fell into seminary, but that's not quite true. That's not quite true. I spent a semester during my college years at American University. They have a semester called the Washington semester. It was perfect for me because my hope was to move to Washington, D.C. with my law degree and work in advocacy for the causes of justice. During that semester at American University, I worked for my U.S. congressman on the Hill, and I was learning the whole time I was there. And one day, I remember it vividly, I was on the subway, going from Capitol Hill to my dorm or some such thing, feeling the city. And I knew it was wrong. I knew it wasn't for me. In that moment, it became clear to me that there wasn't enough there, that I needed something more. I knew that that path was not going to make it possible for me to follow my heart to the work of healing and justice. That was then just a few months before I visited my first Unitarian Universalist congregation. And on that first Sunday, saw what had been missing, the work of soul in healing and justice work. So that was my path to congregational ministry, and I couldn't be more grateful for 27 years of the ministry of healing and justice in communities, working together at the communities of people as we seek to call out the very best each one of us has to bring to the world and to transform the world with acts of love and justice. My very first congregation was south of here in Macon, Georgia, little bitty town. It was 1987, and AIDS was just so scary, and people weren't talking about it. Nobody else in town was doing gay weddings. I learned so much in that congregational ministry setting. And then coming here to Nashville, I learned about justice and community in the aftermath of misconduct and the real harm that happens when someone's moral integrity is violated. Through all of that and my love for parish ministry, I never dreamed I would do anything else. And I feel like the most blessed person in the world that I have had a sense of coming full circle, finding a ministry of healing and justice for our larger movement in this work at UUSC, bringing together everything that I love and care about. All of my years in parish ministry, I knew about the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee. We always did guests at your table. I was often a donor to the work. But the thing that surprised me the most when I started this new position about 1.5 years ago is how much I didn't know. I had no idea, the depth and breadth of the history of the work of UUSC and the current work that is happening on behalf of Unitarian Universalist values all around the world. So I would like to take just a few minutes here at the beginning to tell you a little bit about that, because I'm guessing you will be surprised too, and because it is my passion that every Unitarian Universalist will understand that we have an organization that is doing this important work around the world on behalf of our values, and I hope this is something that will make you very proud and that will give you hope and maybe even a little courage. Many of you know, I'm sure, that UUSC was founded 80 years ago. This coming spring, we will be celebrating our 80th birthday. Martha and Waitstill Sharp traveled to Prague at the dawn of the war. It was immediately after the Munich Agreement that had ceded a great deal of the Czech Republic to Germany on the condition and understanding that Hitler wasn't going to go any farther. And Unitarian Universalists, Unitarians had a deep relationship with folks in the Czech Republic. We had a very large church there. Does the name Norbert Čapek ring a bell? Yep. What does it remind you of?
The room in the Morgan House.
Oh, there's a room in the Morgan House. That's great. Jim?
Flower communion.
And flower communion, right. So Norbert Čapek, of course, was the minister there, a very large congregation. The wife of the president of the Czech Republic was an American Unitarian woman. So there were a lot of relationships, and so when this happened, a great deal of concern among the leadership, and they called on ministers who could go and help. The story is, I wish I knew if this were true or not, but the story is that Waitstill Sharp was the 17th minister that the AUA called to ask to go to Prague. Doesn't matter. Waitstill and Martha said yes, and they traveled to Prague that winter and set up an office and were the hub of all of the American aid that was coming into Europe at that time. They came home for a while. I could spend all evening telling you these wonderful stories, but I'll just tell you a few little of the highlights. They went back to Lisbon and set up an office there. They had offices over time in Lisbon and Geneva and in France, providing education, milk. When Martha got back the second time, the first need she learned about was milk, and it required a great deal of just clever design to create a process that would make it possible to get milk into dangerous places. But perhaps most importantly, Martha designed the very first children's transport of children, rescuing children out of Germany. At our 75th anniversary 5 years ago, 3 of the peoples who are still alive, who were rescued during that time by Martha and Waitstill, were present with us. Even then, like now, the Unitarian Service Committee was tiny. We Unitarian Universalists know how to be mighty even while we're tiny, right? And this is the seeds of a lot of the structure and philosophy of the Service Committee. That is that we don't have money to throw around, and so we have to work hard on building relationships of impact and rely on expertise on the ground, and that was the approach from the very beginning, the creation of real impact through trusting relationships. So very briefly, just a few things about us now. We were founded, as I said, in 1940. We have, 50 is actually a little bit high. We're concentrating our work, so we're closer to 35 right now partners in over 20 countries. About 2/3 of our work is international and 1/3 is domestic. We have 42 staff members, a budget of under $9 million for all of this work, and a very good rating. Some of you know, because I know a lot of people, when they're making donations to crisis response, look this up, but Charity Navigator has consistently given us 4 stars for our transparency and the responsible use of our money. We work in 3 primary areas of work. So our mission is human rights. That's big. And so we have to focus and be disciplined in where we put our resources, and we do this in 3 areas. Actually, I have pictures, I think. Do I have pictures? So climate forced displacement is one of our areas of work. We work with this is our newest body of work. We work with indigenous communities around the world, in the South Pacific, in Alaska, in Louisiana, in Bangladesh, with indigenous communities who are immediately facing the impacts of the climate crisis, many of whom have already been forced to move, many of whom their livelihoods are threatened by the climate crisis. And our primary work in this area is about helping communities with self-determination, because these indigenous communities are people who are not consulted when decisions are made about their lives and their communities. And so we're working very hard with them. There's a lot to say, but I'm gonna go pretty quickly through this. Migrant justice is our second area of work. We're working right now on the Central American migrant crisis. We've been in Central America for decades, so lots of long-standing relationships there. We work in country, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, seeking to support people who are trying to create conditions there to make it possible for people to stay home, because you know what? Everybody wants to stay home. Nobody wants to leave home. And so working with those communities, violence against women, protecting water defenders, and many other responses to the conditions that are forcing people to move. In Mexico, we're working on creating safety for the journey, and in the United States on helping to create the right to asylum, and I'll be saying a little more about that later. And then finally, crisis response is an area of work we're probably most known for. These are shorter term projects where there's an immediate crisis. It might be a natural disaster or a political disaster of some kind that's an immediate crisis. The Syrian refugee crisis is a good example of that, and again, I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. So this is a wonderful way for us to be able to respond, and when Unitarian Universalists are hoping to be part of crisis response, our philosophy here is that we don't want to be part of the large system of crisis response, which you may be reading about. There's a lot of exposure about the way a lot of crisis response work actually does more harm than good. And it always advantages the people who have plenty, and not only doesn't help people who are already vulnerable, but at the end of a disaster, what they've found is people who have plenty end up with more. And people who are already vulnerable end up with a great deal less. So equitable recovery is our philosophy for crisis response, and we do a lot of good work around the world. We're in Burma and Haiti and Syria in Eastern Europe and Houston as well. So how we do that, and then I'm going to move on, but just this is the end of us, is our partnerships is the heart of our work. So we believe that the people most affected are the ones who should be making decisions about what happens, and then we support them in their leadership. The people most affected are the leaders. We follow their leadership, we center their experiences and their voices, and we work with them to bring a lot of tools to the table to help create change. One of those tools is funding. We provide a little bit of funding. Again, we don't have a lot of money to throw around, but we almost always work with small groups, usually women-led, indigenous-led groups, and it's not unusual for our money to help a project actually get started. It's also not unusual for our groups to outgrow us and not need us anymore, and we consider that the best kind of success. This technical assistance we provide. Convening is a really important way that we support our partners, bringing them to each other. Funding, so in Alaska last October, we brought
60 partners from around the world, including the South Pacific. There were about 20 folks from the South Pacific who met us up in Alaska, and we spent 4 days together with all of these indigenous leaders. UUSC was, in the background. We were setting up chairs. The indigenous leaders were telling their stories, what's been happening, what's the impact on their communities, what are the solutions they're finding, what can they learn from each other, and what can they be doing together. Convening, legal assistance, research, and I will talk a little bit more about that later. Advocacy and activism is where all of us come in. One of our biggest assets we bring to the work is the community of Unitarian Universalists and other UUSC members, who, when we have a call from a partner in Honduras who needs attention brought to what the work they're trying to do, we can call on our UUs to help amplify their voices with our leaders or wherever it needs to be amplified, and that can really make a difference and have an impact. And then finally, justice education. So I knew when I started at UUSC that I was not a human rights expert and that I had a lot to learn. So I was excited about this and looking forward to knowing the 6, maybe 10 or 12 books that I needed to read so that I would become a human rights expert. And so the thing I've learned most of all is that we have almost no agreement on what human rights are, and very little understanding of what we should be doing about whatever it is they are. So I just wanted to say a little bit this evening about our modern conception of human rights, which is quite new. The term actually isn't very old at all. I mean, ancient philosophers have talked about things like human rights, but the modern conception of human rights really dates to the beginning of the 20th century, and then culminating with World War II. But the genocide in Armenia in the early 20th century was a really important moment. You know that this was actually the origin of the word genocide. It wasn't coined, so that happened in 1917, 1920. The term genocide was coined in reference to that event in 1943. And now, when did the U.S. Congress pass a law recognizing that as genocide? Last week. Now, that's a whole big political conversation, of course, related to our relationship with Turkey and so on. But that's just to give you a sense. That expresses the political complexity of talking about human rights, but there's also just deep philosophical confusion, misunderstanding, and disagreement about human rights. In the early 20th century, Latin American lawyers were advocating for an international mechanism for recognizing human rights and also holding countries accountable. It was Raphael Lemkin, a Polish lawyer, who coined the term genocide, and he said, "Sovereignty cannot be conceived to be the right to kill millions of people." 1943. So, with the middle part of the 20th century and the Holocaust, there was broad agreement that something needed to be said and maybe even done in response to the notion that sovereignty might support a nation's right to kill millions of people. And so the United Nations, of course, was established, and Eleanor Roosevelt was tasked to chair a committee to create a statement about human rights. Are you familiar with this history a little bit? And I brought some copies, so I hope you'll take a look of the document they created. President Roosevelt had already expressed a rather radical notion of the four freedoms. Roosevelt said that we need to support the freedom of speech, worship. Those we're pretty good at. In this country, we're pretty comfortable talking about those kind of freedoms. Want and fear. So that was really the foundation of the conversations that happened there. The initial impulse among many of those present on that committee was that the document needed to articulate support for self-determination. But who was in the room? The colonizers were in the room. So self-determination was off the table, and you won't see it. But the statement itself actually is really quite remarkable. It was an effort to create some means of collective accountability, very expansive statements that includes both the civil rights, the speech and religion, and the economic rights, the right to be free from want and fear. And there was so much promise. On December 10th, 1948, when this document passed, Eleanor Roosevelt received a standing ovation at the United Nations. And here we are today, with little agreement about what human rights are, no sense of how in the world we move forward in addressing violations of moral integrity and human rights, and many, many people. Actually, I'm not sure how this is internationally, but I would say in the United States, many people, most people, dismiss the United Nations out of hand as a meaningless institution. UUSC, and there's also a disagreement about the desirability of international accountability. Some, might even withdraw, say, from the Human Rights Commission. I don't know if you know, that was one of the early things that Trump did, was withdraw from the commission. UUSC still believes that we must engage in international conversation and attempts at accountability through the United Nations, and we do this in a number of ways. The COP Committee of Partners, I forget what it stands for, the Climate Crisis International Gathering that happens every year. UUSC goes, and we bring our partners because the indigenous leaders who are coming up with solutions, who believe that their traditional knowledge is going to make a tremendous difference in addressing climate crisis, and who are immediately facing displacement, many of them, are not invited to the conversation. The event does include, the gathering includes side events, and UUSC has consistently been granted the right to hold side events, and again, we bring our partners, they're able to tell their stories, and we believe it's very important to bring their stories into the conversations. We're also involved in working with advocacy around the International Criminal Court in the case of the Rohingya people in Burma, who have the minority Muslim people who have, that really is a genocide. We are working with other advocates to get the criminal court to take this case. It still hasn't happened, but one of our staff actually just left our staff, has moved to Geneva to be part of setting up this process of trying to move that forward. And then also at the General Assembly. So this year at the General Assembly, again, we hosted a side event because it was a climate forum, you may remember, when they gathered at General Assembly this year in New York. And again, we hosted a side event bringing 4 women leaders from indigenous communities in the United States and Canada to talk about the challenges they're facing and the solutions they're creating in their work. I was able to attend it. It was so moving and powerful to hear their stories. And the day before, I actually had an unusual opportunity. I also had the opportunity to attend the Global Call to Protect Religious Freedom. My friend and colleague and former intern, Susan Frederick Gray, had received an invitation to attend this event, and she was actually already going to be gone. So in our conversation, she said, "Oh, great, then you go to that." So I said, "Great, sure I will." I talked to my staff about this, and a day later, I found out a little more about the event. And actually spent a sleepless night wondering, am I really going to go to this thing? Susan said she wasn't sure she would have, learning that President Trump would be there. So on the first Monday of the General Assembly this year, I had the opportunity to hear in a room of fewer than a couple of thousand people, Donald Trump, Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, who else is up there? Yeah. So, and they were there to talk about a global call for religious freedom. I'm in. Anybody in? What do you think Trump wants? He means to allow discrimination of gay and lesbian parents by religiously affiliated adoption organizations. That happened this week. He needs to protect healthcare workers by allowing them to refuse treatment, discriminate because of religious beliefs, and he means to protect businesses who have the horrific burden of providing services to people who are gay and lesbian. That's not what I mean by human rights. In the room, and the speakers that day weren't just Christians, so I was delighted to see that. A Yemeni rabbi was there. A Uyghur, a woman from China, was there speaking about their religious persecution. So I felt like it was a wonderful opportunity to kind of take them at their word. They didn't mention the Rohingya. I was disappointed by that, but I made some great State Department connections, and we're going to continue in conversation with the global call for religious freedom, because we believe in religious freedom, and we will do what we can to bring these folks along. So in Myanmar, we use Burma for political reasons and because of the activists there. The Rohingya Muslim minority lost their citizenship in 2012. I'm guessing a lot of folks, it's not getting a lot of attention, so just a little bit of background. In 2012, they lost their citizenship. Then we were so hopeful. Aung San Suu Kyi got out of house detention and became a leader in the country, and is completely silent, despite her Nobel Prize for Peace, about the conditions that her military has created in the Rakhine state, where they have forced millions of people to leave their homes, almost 1 million people, sorry, it's about 850,000 people, and the conservative estimates are that killing 10,000 people on their way to moving these folks. It's shocking. It's shocking. And you know how they do this in part is they demonize, they dehumanize the Muslim minority. They call them vermin. You know who calls them vermin? The Buddhist monks are among the leaders, calling human beings vermin. It's shocking. Do you know how many people in the world are displaced today? 40 million. 40 million people are displaced today. It's shocking. The Syrian refugee crisis has been so instructive, and we've learned so much at UUSC from our partners there. In a visit 18 months ago, we were so shocked by what was happening there, just horrified. And our partners in Hungary actually challenged us to consider what was happening in the United States. This was 18 months ago, and our partners in Hungary said, let us tell you how a nation dismantles asylum. And they described 4 steps. First, asylum seekers are denied access. Second, asylum seekers are met with hostile conditions. Government removes safeguards. In Serbia, Hungary designated Serbia as a safe country, and government obstructs integration. Our partners said, you need to be watching. And within 6 months, almost everything they predicted was happening here in the United States. It's shocking. There are a lot of big questions about immigration. A lot of big questions we will not get close to touching tonight. Who should be allowed in? What about our complicity in creating the conditions that are driving migration? The Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that people should have the right to seek asylum in the place of their choosing. Does that mean we have open borders? How will we address the growing numbers? 40 million is a lot of people. What do you think it's going to be in 15 years? But we do not need to go that far to those very big questions to get at some really important conversations and address some real atrocities going on around the world and in the United States right now. I've gotten clear for myself about a few things that I want to share. One is, I think we should abolish ICE. I wasn't sure. I didn't know. I had a lot of questions. It was one of our questions as an organization. Should we get on that bandwagon? And we actually haven't, because not a lot of our partners are involved in that. But do you know when ICE was started?
2001.
ICE hasn't been around a long time. And I believe we should abolish ICE because ICE is the embodiment of what happened in our response to immigration after 9/11, which is the militarization and criminalization of immigration, which was never true. Our response to immigration before ICE, before the Department of Homeland Security, was that immigration services were in a whole other part of the government. Had nothing to do with militarization. But I want to tell you, it's militarized. I saw this up close. That is not the picture. I love this picture. This should have been up when I was talking dramatically about all of that, so can you go back? I'm sorry I missed it. I'm going to read it because I'm guessing you might not be able to. Migration for all living creatures is a move from scarcity toward plenty, from despair toward hope. Humans have their own migratory impulse based on the same fundamental desire coded within all living things: survival. Last December, I traveled with a group of faith leaders and people of conscience to the border in San Diego and Tijuana. I love this picture because it shows what I think is the absurdity, the incredible absurdity of the wall. It's in the ocean. Do you see how far it goes into the ocean?
Far enough.
It was amazing watching the birds fly above, mocking all of us and our ideas about boundaries and how all of that works. But I show you this and tell that story in part to tell you that before we got there, we were paused to do a memorial to the children who have died making the trip. 2 died the week before we came. And the drones arrived at that moment. And they hovered just long enough to get all of our images, and then they took off. And when we got to the border itself, I don't have a picture of this here, the ICE folks, heavily armed, met us in our clergy collars and our stoles and pushed. Oh, you know who was there? Oh gosh, I should have written down his name. The fellow who was the director of the Nashville, Matt Lieber was there. He was one of the leaders. I couldn't believe it when I walked in and we saw each other. It was great fun. Matt was leading and organizing the event. and trying to keep the peace. People were being arrested, that was the point, to draw attention to what's happening. But the ICE officers were particularly aggressive with Mike, knocking him down several times, and finally picked him up, accused him of assaulting them, and he was without contact with us for 2 days in detention. They finally released him. There was no charge. There were hundreds of witnesses to what had happened, but the militarization on the border is real, and it's affecting many, many people. Another thing I believe we should abolish ICE. That's one thing I have come to believe. Another thing that I know is that it is not okay to put children in cages. I happen to think it is also not okay to put adults in cages, but it is not okay to put children in cages. We do this, we feel we can get away with doing this because we have criminalized, dehumanized, partly through criminalization, the person. And so this practice of criminalizing someone for their identity is another thing I've come to believe, that this is deeply wrong to criminalize someone for their religion, their gender, their nationality, their race. And I believe we should not criminalize people for their humanitarian assistance. So I want to tell you about something that's coming up pretty shortly, pretty soon, is the trial of Scott Warren with No More Deaths. These are pictures of outside of Ajo, Arizona, a portion of the desert that the government has essentially weaponized the desert by narrowing the places people can possibly come because they believe, and this is written in their policies, that it would be a deterrent. Narrow the options of where they can go so that where they have to go is deadly. No More Deaths goes through the desert, leaves water, searches for remains, helps families find loved ones who have died on the journey, and a number of volunteers were arrested for trespassing and littering, for leaving their water there in the desert, including Scott Warren, who actually has 2 felony counts against him. The jury was hung this summer, but the government said, oh, we got to get this guy, so next week, actually a week from now, the 19th of this month, he will be tried again. If you have an opportunity to learn more, to write a letter to the editor, to share this, we need to spread the word that humanitarian assistance is never a crime. So when Lois was speaking with me about the lecture, she said, we want to do a new thing. We need an action plan. So I just gave you one thing to do. One thing I want to do is thank those of you who are here who are members of UUSC. Would you raise your hand if you are a member of UUSC? And the rest of you, look around and ask these folks if you want more information. One of the things you can do is partner with us. We carry you with us no matter what, because your values are what guide our work. But your support, we're a completely independent organization, and the only way we operate is through the support of congregations and individuals. So thank you, everyone who supports us, and we invite you to be members. And I know that it's often, the question is, but is all we can do give money? Well, no, but let's not belittle the power of giving money, because that is the way that we provide grants, bring people together, and do all of the work that we do. So, and even if you're not in a position to give money now, I would ask that you, and Lois will ask this too, fill out one of our envelopes so that we can contact you. Because when we're in February, we're in the courtroom in Honduras with some water defenders who are facing trial. They called us and said, we need international observers here. We need the court to know that there are people watching. That's the power of our membership, is that we can convey to international players that we have people paying attention, calling their legislators, calling the embassy, it makes a difference. It matters. The folks who were on trial in February were acquitted. There were questions from the judge about the tweets we were looking at, which were tweets we had managed to get from some U.S. senators about what was happening in Guampanal Valley. Very powerful impact that we can have. Sometimes things just come together in a way that we can make a real difference. I have to add that the most recent 12 charged in that same community are being held without having received a trial yet, and so we continue to advocate for them and will be present when they are on trial again. So please sign up for that's something you can do. That's something you can do. You can take action on TPS. Learn about TPS. Do you know TPS, temporary protected status? It's one of the ways that people who are facing desperate situations in their countries are given status, a protected status in the United States, and Trump's trying to get rid of all of it. So learn about TPS. There's several pieces of legislation right now that you can be part of advocating around. Take part in a College of Social Justice trip. We do trips for congregations to the border where you can learn more about what it is at the border, what's happening, what's needed. Look into the College of Social Justice. Most importantly, what I want to say for action is to build relationships of trust with people who are impacted right here in Nashville by injustice and violations of human rights. And as we do our work for justice, perhaps the second most important principle, the first is following the lead of people most affected. The second is, for us at UUSC, is to, while responding to an immediate need that becomes clear, someone has an immediate need, we have to respond and provide support. Never stop there. At least ask the question, what are the conditions that are creating this need? At least ask the question. And please, please make some of your justice work about addressing the conditions that are creating the harm. Because if all we do is respond with direct service to an immediate need, if we stop there, then we can become part of the system that is perpetuating the injustice. So always at least ask the question. Eleanor Roosevelt said, all those slides were so good. They went with all that I said. I'm so sorry. Eleanor Roosevelt said, "Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any of the maps of the world. Yet they are a world of an individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college she attends, the factory, farm, or office where she works. It starts here. If you're part of a local community, start there." The pledge, the Nashville Pledge to End Racism that I saw the wonderful sign for, what a wonderful way, educating yourselves about what's happening and looking at our own relationship with the problem and moving from there. And then move beyond that. And what I would ask is, even in this time, when our national situation is demanding so much of our attention, is breaking our hearts in so many ways, please don't stop. Also remember that around the world there are people who are desperately hurting because of persecution and injustice. And at UUSC, we believe all of us want to be part of responding to needs around the world, carrying our values and creating human rights around the world. So do one thing, do it locally, do it at the state level, do it nationally, and don't forget that around the world there is so much need. The second thing I want to say is that's not enough. That's what I felt on that train in Washington, D.C., is that's not enough. We also have to grow our souls and deepen our own courage, our faith, and I'm using the word imagination because by faith I really mean imagination, and our hope. These are folks in Kiribati, one of the islands in the South Pacific where we have partners. And on the Global Climate Strike Day, this is what they did. We are not drowning. We are fighting. They walked right into the ocean. What I mean by faith and imagination is that we set down cynicism, that we refuse to be drawn by the allure of cynicism. Cynicism, a lack of imagination, and cynicism are the tools of empires and tyrants. Together, build your faith. Practice faithful imagination. Imagine a new way. Susan was telling me, Susan Frederick Gray, for those of you who don't know, was the intern here and is now the president of UUA. She told me the story she learned here that I had never heard. One of you told her this, and you never told me this. She said, somebody in the Nashville church, I can't remember who it was, told me the thing about courage is it's 10 miles wide, it's 10 miles tall. There wasn't anyone in the room, apparently, and a 1/4 inch deep. There's a great midrash on the story of the Red Sea. Moses takes the people to freedom, but they don't want to go. They're scared to death. And there's the roaring sea, and the Egyptian soldiers are behind them, right? Well, the midrash, the rabbis tell this great interpretation of the story that suggests that it wasn't God, it wasn't Moses with his wand or whatever that caused the sea to part. What caused the sea to part was Nahshon. The old man Nahshon, he just walked right in. He walked in, up to his knees, up to his waist, up to his chin. Everyone was yelling, "Come back, Nahshon, you're crazy, stop it." And as soon as it got almost over his head, the sea parted. And the rabbis say, sometimes all you need for a miracle is to take that first step. Hope isn't easy. And you know why it's not easy? Because it asks something of us. And I think that's sometimes why we resist hope, because it makes a demand of us. I want to close with a poem by the Slovakian poet Boris Novak entitled Decisions. Between two words, choose the quieter one. Between word and silence, choose listening. Between two books, choose the dustier one. Between the earth and the sky, choose the bird. Between two children, choose them both. Sorry. Between the lesser and the bigger evil, choose neither. Between hope and despair, choose hope. It will be harder to bear. Amen. And thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. I
I truly enjoyed that. It was so informative, and I learned a lot, as I'm sure everybody in the audience did. So thank you. I also want to thank all of you for being here tonight. My name is Lois Wagner, and I'm a member of this congregation, and I'm a member of the Palmer Lecture Committee. I know you all have a lot of questions for Reverend Morn, and in a few minutes we will have a brief question and answer period, followed by a reception in the fellowship hall where there still is, you will have an opportunity to talk more with the Reverend Morn, but also we do have leftover desserts and coffee and wine, and you're welcome to partake in that as well. As many of you may know, may not, each year the Palmer Lecture is funded by donations received from members of this congregation through individual member donations and from you, the people who attend these lectures. We use the money we receive through our donations to fund next year's, as seed money, to fund next year's lecture, but this year we're doing something a little bit different. We are privileged to give 50% of the donations that we receive tonight to the UUSC in support of their incredible work on behalf of human rights issues around the world. And so I hope that you will give generously. As the Reverend Morn mentioned earlier, the UUSC would like to continue this conversation once you leave this room and go into the outside world. If you would like to receive communications, and they would love to communicate with you, if you would like to receive communications from the UUSC, you'll find this envelope. I think it was given to you in the program that you were given, and you can use this envelope to put down your contact information, and we will make sure that the Reverend Morn gets that and that you begin to receive communications. It wasn't in there, but should have been. I'm sorry. And we'll make sure there are some at the table, too. I'm not sure we had enough to go around for everybody, but you can have mine. I've got an extra. And, but anyway, any way we can get the contact information from you, we would really appreciate that, and we will make sure that Reverend Morn gets that information so that you can receive communications from the UUSC. As the plate is passed, please put this envelope in there along with your donation, and we will make sure that it's parsed out the way we have intended, 50% going to the Palmer Lecture for next year, and 50% going to the UUSC. If you write a check, I do want to remind you to make it out to the First UU Nashville Church and just mark on the bottom line that it's earmarked for the Palmer Lecture. Finally, I want to let you know that while we're receiving the offertory, our pianist, Holling Smith Bourne, will play a song that many of us know called Fire of Commitment, which many of you may know or may not know was co-written by the Reverend Morn and Jason Shelton. And we will not be singing the song tonight, but if you would like to follow the lyrics to the song, you can find the lyrics on page 1028 in the teal hymnal, which you'll find in front of you in the pew. For additional information on the UUSC, please stop at the table we have up there in the fellowship hall. I think, as Reverend Morn said, you have some interesting information about human rights, as well as information about the UUSC. Again, following the receipt of the offertory, we will have a brief question and answer period, and please join us after that in the fellowship hall for a reception afterward. Again, thank you so much for being here. I can't tell you how much we on the Palmer Lecture Committee appreciate it, and how much we appreciate it on behalf of the UUSC. Thank you. Thank you so much, Holly. It was beautiful. We will now receive questions for the Reverend Morn, and thank you so very much.
Mary
We'll see you-
Catherine.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's very nice and formal.
I can't help it. I worked in university.
I have 3 more pages. If you don't have any questions, I'm glad to just do those. Just kidding.
And before anybody asks questions, these microphones have a very short distance to them, so please stand like this close to them. And I just cleaned them, so don't worry about getting too close. But if you stand back here, we're not going to be able to hear you, so you need to be right here. You're also not going to be on camera, and if you can't make it to one of these microphones, I have a handheld mic. Just raise your hand and I'll bring it to you.
Hi. Can you tell us some of the stories that the people shared at these convenings that really touched you?
Yeah, can you tell me your name?
Julie Nolan.
Julie, thank you. So I had the privilege, I was very blessed to be able to be at the convening in Anchorage for just the first couple of days, but I didn't include a picture, but we had a graphic illustrator. That's the stories come so to life there. So in one of the islands on the South Pacific, one of our partners is working with people with disabilities who have been, so first we have the indigenous community who's excluded from the conversations that are going on, and then the people with disabilities, further at risk and marginalized in the larger community. And the way this organization is we weren't able to have someone who had a disability travel. They weren't able to come, but brought a message of gratitude and hope about their being involved in the conversations and the solutions, and how much it meant and how that was creating so much power in that person's life. The main thing that that was my very first experience of being in a setting that was solely indigenous people. And the thing that touched me the most was the value of honor that they brought and carried. It's not a Western, we don't practice that value in that way. So we saw it from the very beginning. Whenever anyone greeted, they honored, specifically and with words, their elders. They honored the children. I wish I could show you a video of some of the traditional dance that they brought. And of course, they honored the earth. And in every case of the stories, whether it was in Alaska, where the permafrost is making it impossible for them to grow their food, that their subsistence living, they are unable to continue to live the way they live, which is subsistence living because of the disappearance of the permafrost, or whether it is in the islands where water is encroaching and they're having to adapt in numerous ways, and some of them beginning to think about relocation, and some of them saying, no, this is indigeneity. Actually, kind of the definition of that is connected to the land. So the displacement of these communities is devastating. I was going somewhere toward that. So the honor, and then in whichever case, whatever they were facing, each and every community reflected that their traditional knowledge of how to be in relationship with the earth is what we need, is the thing we need right now. At the United Nations a couple of weeks ago, it was really interesting to hear one of the women in Canada talk about the way when the United States protects land, what they find is that it's so completely contrary to the way the people who have lived there have always protected the land, because we wall it off. We wall off the land. And this woman said, you can't protect the land if you're not in relationship with the land. It's so obvious. That's just a little. Thank you for the question, Julie.
You're already answering a lot of what I wanted to ask, which is what I took away from your talk primarily was the people most affected taking the leadership in UUSC helping. And I just wanted to invite you to elaborate on that any way that you wanted to, about how UUSC learned how to do that, or what kinds of ways the indigenous people step forward.
I really do, in the beginning, I kind of referred to this. I really do think that in some ways there's a blessing to being small and being forced to be in close relationship and work through relationship, because I think you grow to understand the impact of the relationship, and you just can't fall back on sending lots of money. It reminds me of another story, but then maybe I'll just come right back. When our team was in Serbia about a month ago with our partners closing down the work from the Syrian refugee crisis, one of the partners told stories about the way the big aid organizations come in sometimes and take all of the talent that's there and concentrate all of the resources. And so the smaller groups and the groups that are often overlooked end up in worse shape than they were in before. And it was just, I wasn't there, but one of our vice presidents was able to be there, and she said it just was so moving to hear them convey the impact of the way we are in relationship with them. One example is with grant making. So grant making is a terrific burden on an institution, and when you're working with a very small institution, you know, they go online and they get a 12-page application to receive $5,000, you know, and it has to be for a special new project. So one of the things that we're very conscious of is the burden that comes with being an organization receiving aid. That sounds kind of confusing, counterintuitive, but we work really hard to do that. And so how did we learn to do that? I think it's in the DNA. I think it is inherent in our values, our UU values, but we so often forget it because so many UUs have come out of the dominant culture and have always, you know, just known all the things. We just know, and it's true. I mean, we've known all the things. And so that's how we are in the world. And in relationship, you discover very fast how much you don't know. So I think that's a gift, it's a great question, and I'll probably reflect on it more. Thank you. John.
John Harkey's my name. Two people graduated with me from college. One of them, Charlie Clements. I was wondering if you hear from him. And the other one is Barry LaForgia, who runs a companion organization, IRT, International Relief Teams. Do you work with either? What's happened with Charlie, and do you work with Barry?
Charlie was the CEO of UUSC 3 before me, and he was the first one I really got to know well. Charlie was a wonderful leader who had been deeply involved in Central America. He went on to run the Carr Center for Human Rights at Harvard after leaving UUSC. He's living with his wife in California now. They have some family there. He's involved in a project. They just wrote us and said, we've got a bill. This Ohio junior representative is going to introduce it. Do you want to support it? And it is perfect for us. It's right in line with our partners' work. So I'm excited to kind of be partnering with Charlie again a little bit, doing well. And we haven't worked. I mean, we have no doubt worked with IRT. I haven't had connections yet with IRT. Thanks. Jeff.
Hi, Jeff Stein. This is just a practical question because it's something I've often wondered about, and maybe if I went to the college to learn about it.
Yeah.
But you talked about the going into San Diego and going to the border, and if I understood you correct, one of the things was either the expectation or the intention of being arrested. So if you are a non-clergy person who wants to do that, what is the expectation that you will have of consequences, costs of being arrested?
So actually, the results of those arrests just happened. And it was, so a number of the people who were arrested paid a fine. A number of people who were arrested said, no, I'm not paying a fine. That's not the point. I want to draw attention to what's happening, and their charges were just acquitted. So there are a number of philosophies that people take. I think the primary goal, as I understand it, of that kind of witness is about bringing attention. I walked into the desert with water last summer. UUSC brought 40 faith leaders, no more deaths, where the volunteers were charged, called us and said, we think that it would be helpful to draw attention. Could you get leaders, religious leaders, to come and witness to this? And so we brought 40 folks there. The folks in the photograph those are photographs I took. Most of these photographs were not, I can do this, pictures that I took. I think I can do this. Oh, maybe I can't do this. You saw the guys in the desert, and we weren't sure if we were going to be arrested, but it was the last thing they wanted, was to arrest us. And so, they just kind of nodded and then looked the other way and let us go on our way. Those arrests were made, by the way, Scott Warren's felony charges were brought the day after film that No More Deaths went viral, of the federal agents going through the desert and emptying the water jugs. So part of No More Deaths work is to kind of expose the practices. And so this went viral, and the next day Scott was charged with these felonies. Good.
Hi, I'm David Dickens.
Hi, David.
I want to ask a question about a topic you didn't talk about, and so if it's off limits, let me know. Okay. A group of us are getting really interested in environmental action kinds of things, and I wonder if the UUSC has any initiatives related to environmental justice, environmental issues.
So our work right now is solely focused on indigenous communities who are impacted by climate crisis. The College of Social Justice has some programs. So the College of Social Justice, let me say, is a joint project. It has a terrible name because it does not tell you what it is at all. It's a joint project between the UUA and UUSC that provides, it was designed for youth and young adults, but we found interest with all adults, provides intense training for grounding justice work in values. And that does make me think of the Nashville Pledge to End Racism. That kind of work of really looking at what are the values we're bringing, what are the issues we're facing. And so we have border trips that we do. We have a trip to West Virginia around poverty and living wage. And we don't currently have any trips related to the climate justice work, but we may well, because some of our partners are on the coast of Louisiana. We're just now, figuring out what that work is. I think a lot of it's going to be legal. It's just devastating what's happening to the people there. And so there may well come a time when our work has matured enough that we can bring people. We are intensely protective of our partners. And again, the burden of being a small organization means that very often it's difficult for them to use volunteers or to have us bring people to them. And so we take great care with that. But please stay tuned and watch the work as it evolves, because I think there will be lots more opportunities. The work on climate forced displacement evolved out of our work on the human right to water. Do some of you remember that campaign? That was 15 years. And we really made some traction and had some impact through that work, and through that work made connections that led us into this work of climate forced displacement. And we were among the first NGOs looking at this work, engaging with these partners. And in fact, one of the early pieces of work we did, which wasn't directly with partners. I mean, they helped us with it, but we actually created a funder's guide around climate force displacement because folks really didn't know how to engage and what to do to help. So if you know a foundation who's doing that work, we can get them the funder's guide. Hi, Dick, you want to? Yep, great.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
I was listening to NPR about a week and a half ago, and they were talking about population on the planet and said that we now have about 7.5 billion people on this planet. And then by 2050, we'll have approximately 11.5 billion people on this planet. And
by what year?
2050, this person was saying, done a lot of research on this. I'm not asking you, what can you do about this? But I'm really concerned. Well, I mean, there are things to do about it, but I'm really concerned about that as a fundamental underlying issue in all of these immigration issues and climate change issues and so forth and so on. We have so many people on this planet, and it seems like we just blithely go on reproducing and, as if there's no tomorrow. And, I don't know if you have anything to say about that or not, or if the Unitarian Service Organization has any connection with people who are trying to address that. It just, to me, is crazy that we're not hearing more about this and people really standing up and saying something about it.
I appreciate it, Dick. You're not actually the first person to ask me in this role that question, so I should do a little more reading about it. The thing I know is that it is culturally a very challenging question, that in terms of international culture, and it's a very challenging question, and I don't know much more than that. It's not helpful. It's June. Ask me something I can answer.
Well, I think the main way to deal with main way to deal with population issues is empowering women. That's where you don't have population problems. That's where women are empowered with their reproductive rights.
Thank you. And she's smart. And one of the reasons that UUSC, among many other organizations, looks at funding women who are leading. Guest at Your Table this year tells the story of 4 of our fabulous women leaders who are partners. And it feels like time to close. I'm going to share a little bit of a reading to close about faith and imagination and how important it is. I said that a lack of imagination and cynicism is a tool of empires and tyrants. I really believe that. And I was thinking about that in response to work from Rebecca Solnit, who's a wonderful writer, who wrote a piece in March during the first global climate strike for the climate strikers, for the youth climate strikers. And this is what she said to them. She's using the phrase, "don't be reasonable," which for me is kind of a way of saying, use your imagination. Because, when people say don't be reasonable, they always mean, don't question authority. That's what's always happening. Well, maybe not always, but so here's what Solnit said. "I want to say to all the climate strikers today, thank you so much for being unreasonable. That is, if reasonable means playing by the rules, and the rules are presumed to be guidelines for what is and is not possible. Then you may be told that what you are asking for is impossible or unreasonable. Don't listen. Don't stop. Don't let your dreams shrink by 1 inch. Don't forget that this might be the day or the year when we rewrite what is possible." May it be so.